A single strip of sand sits between two bodies of water. On one side, the Atlantic rolls onto a flat beach. On the other, a shallow sound extends to a low horizon. The ground looks entirely static, a line of dunes, a two-lane asphalt road, and a few scattered buildings anchored in sand. But the measurement instruments tell a different story. Every year, this entire coast shifts position by several meters, sliding westward toward the mainland, while the ocean steadily consumes its eastern margin. What is remarkable is not that sand islands move, but that this entire chain was surveyed, settled, and built upon under the assumption that it was permanent ground, an assumption that persisted through centuries of mapped wreckages, displaced towns, and shifting channels. Why did the official record treat a migrating river of sand as solid geography for so long? And what happens when the sea reclaims the ground under that error? To answer that, you have to look at how people first mapped this coast. Early cartographers saw the barrier chain as a protective wall, a natural breakwater shielding the interior of the continent. It was an entirely reasonable view for a sailor looking at a chart in the 17th century. The outer shore seemed fixed because it remained on the map, generation after generation. But the crack in that assumption appears the moment you look at the physical structures built on it. 35. The lighthouse they had to move. The Cape Hatteras Lighthouse was completed in 1870, a brick tower rising 59 meters above the beach. When the builders placed it, they set it nearly 460 meters back from the high water mark. That seemed like a permanent margin. By the 1990s, however, coastal erosion had reduced that distance to just 36 meters. A single severe Atlantic storm could have undermined the entire foundation. In 1999, a specialized moving firm jacked the 4,000-ton structure onto a system of steel rails and moved it 880 meters inland over 23 days, costing roughly 12 million Canadian dollars. The tower was not moved for restoration. It was moved because the solid ground beneath it had vanished into the sea. 34. The densest ship graveyard in the hemisphere. Offshore, the ocean bed drops away into an expanse that has claimed more than 2,000 verified vessel losses since the first recorded sinking in 1526. Historians from institutions like the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic and regional archives estimate the true total could approach 5,000. That represents a documented loss roughly every 2.5 years over 5 centuries. The losses span every era: early wooden sailing ships, 19th century coastal traders, and steel tankers sunk during the 20th century. The ocean floor here holds the highest density of historical shipwrecks anywhere in North American waters. 33. A continuous herd 5 centuries old. On the far northern beaches, beyond the end of the paved road network, lives a herd of wild horses known as bankers. DNA analysis confirms their direct lineage, traces back to Iberian stock brought to this coast by 16th century expeditions. They have occupied this environment for roughly 500 years, longer than any modern administrative boundary has existed on the continent. To survive on an isolated sandbar with no permanent surface streams, the herd digs shallow pits into the sand to tap the fresh water floating just beneath the surface. 32. The channel where a legendary flagship met its end. The shallow, shifting channels behind the barrier islands provided cover for early maritime raiders whose deep-draft naval pursuers could not follow. In November 1718, a British naval expedition ambushed Edward Teach, known as Blackbeard, in the shallow passage off Ocracoke Island. The engagement ended in a hand-to-hand fight aboard a small sloop, concluding one of the most documented anti-piracy operations of the colonial era in the very shallows that made the coast unnavigable to standard ships. 31. The collision of two ocean systems. Directly off Cape Hatteras, two massive oceanic currents crash into each other. From the south, the Gulf Stream brings warm water up from the tropics. From the north, the cold Labrador Current flows south out of the subarctic. Oceanographic measurements recorded by regional research programs show water temperatures can jump or drop by up to 15 degrees Celsius within the space of a few kilometers. This energetic boundary throws up massive underwater sandbars, fuels sudden coastal fog, and creates an exceptionally rich marine ecosystem where cold water and warm water species meet. 30. The town that packed up and floated away. On Shackleford Banks, a barrier island along this chain, there was once a permanent settlement called Diamond City. By the late 19th century, roughly 500 residents lived there, sustaining an economy built around coastal shore whaling. On August 17, 1899, a severe hurricane known as the San Ciriaco storm drove directly across the sandbar. The storm surge destroyed the primary protective dune line and inundated the community. Rather than rebuild, the inhabitants made an extraordinary decision. Over the following months, they dismantled their wooden homes timber by timber, lashed the structures onto barrels and logs, and floated them across the open sound to reassemble them on the mainland. Today, no permanent human structures remain on the island, leaving only the wild horse herd behind. 29. The all-black life-saving crew. The official record overlooked. In 1880, the United States Life-Saving Service appointed Richard Etheridge to take command of the Pea Island Life-Saving Station. Etheridge, born into slavery on this coast in 1842, had served in the United States colored troops during the Civil War. When appointed keeper, the white surfman resigned rather than serve under him, and the original station was destroyed by arson. Etheridge rebuilt the station and assembled an all-black crew. On October 11, 1896, during a violent hurricane, the crew rescued all 9 passengers and crew from the grounded schooner E.S. Newman by swimming lines through the surf 10 separate times. Despite their record, it took until 1996, a full century later, for the federal government to officially recognize their service with the Gold Life-Saving Medal. 28. The underwater sandbar reaching 22 kilometers into the ocean. Where the northern and southern currents collide, they drop massive quantities of sediment, forming diamond shoals, a shifting underwater ridge extending up to 22 kilometers offshore into open Atlantic waters. In areas where surrounding ocean depths reach 7 to 9 meters, these shoals can rise to within 1 meter of the surface, creating an invisible hazard for deep draft shipping. The sands shift so rapidly during winter nor'easters that hydrographic charts become outdated within months. In January 1921, the 5-masted schooner Carroll A. Deering was found hard aground on the shoals, with its sails set and galley prepared, but with its entire crew missing. A multi-agency government investigation failed to identify what happened to the crew, highlighting how the treacherous conditions of the shoals could erase all physical evidence. 27. A coastal dialect isolated for 3 centuries. On Ocracoke Island, accessible only by water or air, a distinct English dialect known as the Ocracoke brogue has survived into the modern era. Settled in the early 1700s by maritime pilots stationed there to guide ships through the inlet, the island remained geographically isolated from the mainland for generations. Linguists from North Carolina State University who have documented the speech pattern note that it preserves elements of 18th century English, including distinct vowel shifts and vocabulary items like mamic, meaning to harass or exhaust. With fewer than 100 fluent native speakers remaining and seasonal tourism bringing thousands of visitors daily, sociolinguists project the dialect may disappear within a generation. 26. The 19th century ironclad that defined marine conservation. The USS Monitor, a Revolutionary Union ironclad designed with a low freeboard and a revolving gun turret, sank during a gale off Cape Hatteras on December 31, 1862, while under tow. The vessel went down in 70 meters of water, taking 16 crew members with it. The wreck remained undiscovered until the 18th of September 1973, when a research team from Duke University Marine Laboratory located the remains using side-scan sonar. In 1975, the surrounding waters were designated as the country's very first national marine sanctuary, creating the legal prototype for modern ocean floor protection. In 2002, naval salvors and oceanographers successfully raised the vessel's 150-ton iron turret, transferring it to a museum for long-term conservation. 25. The moving mountain of sand behind the beach. Rising directly behind the coastline at Nag's Head is Jockey's Ridge, a bare sand dune system standing between 24 and 30 meters tall, making it the highest active sand dune on the Atlantic seaboard. The dune possesses no vegetation to anchor it, causing its elevation and contours to shift continuously under seasonal prevailing winds. Over the past century, the advancing sand has buried and subsequently re-exposed roads, structures, and small commercial sites. In 1973, local opposition halted a commercial development project that would have leveled the dune, leading to its preservation as a protected state park. 24. The relocation of the first powered flight. While historical markers and popular accounts associate the first powered airplane flight in December 1903 with the village of Kitty Hawk, the actual flights took place 6 kilometers to the south at Big Kill Devil Hill. Wilbur and Orville Wright selected the site after writing to the Weather Bureau in 1900 to request a list of locations with high average wind speeds, extensive open sand for soft landings, and minimal population. The extreme wind conditions and sandy terrain that created centuries of maritime hazards were the exact geographic variables required to achieve sustained flight. 23. The northern limit of Atlantic sea turtle nesting. 5 distinct species of sea turtles, loggerhead, green, leatherback, hawksbill, and Kemp's ridley, frequent the waters around Cape Hatteras. The region serves as one of the few places along the Atlantic coast where all 5 species have been recorded crawling ashore to nest. Biological monitoring conducted by the Geological Survey and wildlife agencies since 1995 confirms that the collision of warm and cold ocean currents provides a crucial navigational corridor, making this coastline the northernmost reliable nesting boundary for loggerhead populations. 22. An inlet created in a single storm. Oregon Inlet, the primary ocean gap separating Bodie Island from Hatteras Island, did not exist prior to September 1846. On September 7, 1846, a major hurricane forced a massive storm surge across the barrier strip, scouring a brand new channel between the Sound and the ocean in a matter of hours. Survey records show that since its formation, the inlet has migrated southward at a rate of roughly 30 meters per year due to longshore drift, moving over 3 kilometers down the coast and forcing engineers to replace the ocean bridge across it in 2019. But while storm events can carve new channels through the sand overnight, what happens when human conflict collides with this fragile maritime boundary? 21. The rescue team that launched into a sea of burning fuel. On August 16, 1918, during the closing months of the First World War, the German submarine U-117 torpedoed the British tanker Merlot, roughly 11 kilometers off Hatteras Island. Loaded with refined gasoline and petroleum products, the vessel exploded, creating a massive surface slick that ignited across hundreds of meters of open ocean. Station keeper John Allen Midget of the Chickamaucomico Life-Saving Station launched a 6-man wooden motor lifeboat directly toward the column of smoke. Navigating into the middle of the burning slick with wet canvas covering their faces, the crew used oars to clear paths through burning oil, ultimately rescuing 42 survivors from capsized lifeboats and guiding them through 4-meter surf to shore. All 6 surfmen were subsequently awarded the Grand Cross of the American Cross of Honor. 20. The northern beach corridor where the public highway ends. At the northern termination of North Carolina Highway 12, past the village of Corolla, the paved roadway ends at a security gate, giving way to 21 kilometers of unpaved beach strand extending toward the Virginia boundary. The community of Corova consists of several hundred residences built across sand dunes with no interior street grid, relying on 4-wheel drive vehicles traveling along the intertidal zone at low tide. School transportation, postal delivery, and emergency services operate across the active beach face. The area received no paved highway connection to the rest of the barrier chain until 1984, preserving a region where human infrastructure remains directly tied to tide schedules and coastal sand movement. 19. The flagship discovered in 6 meters of water. The Queen Anne's Revenge, a 300-ton former French slave ship captured and refitted with up to 40 cannons by Edward Teach, ran aground on an offshore sandbar near Beaufort Inlet in June 1718. Despite resting in roughly 6 meters of water, less than 3 kilometers off the coast, the wreckage remained unidentified for nearly 280 years. In 1996,
private marine survey firm Intersal Inc., utilizing high-resolution marine magnetometer sweeps and side-scan sonar, detected a dense anomaly field on the seabed. Subsequent underwater excavations directed by state archaeologists recovered over 400,000 individual artifacts, including 24 cast-iron cannons, leading to official state confirmation of the vessel's identity in 2012. 18. The hydrological dome floating beneath the sand. Barrier islands surrounded by saline ocean water rely on a subterranean freshwater system known to hydrologists as a freshwater lens. Rainwater falling on the sand percolates downward, floating on top of the denser salt water below due to differences in specific gravity. Under the Geibin-Hertzberg principle, for every meter the water table rises above sea level, the freshwater lens extends approximately 40 meters downward into the sand matrix before transitioning to brackish water.
Hydrogeological monitoring by Natural Resources Canada and oceanographic institutes demonstrates that this subterranean freshwater reservoir is what sustains local vegetation, terrestrial fauna, and historical human settlements across sandbars that lack surface rivers. 17. The 20-year acquisition of the nation's first national seashore. In 1937, during the Great Depression, the United States Congress authorized the creation of Cape Hatteras National Seashore as the first protected national seashore in the country, encompassing 112 kilometers of barrier island coastline and over 9,700 hectares. However, acquiring the thousands of individually owned land parcels across the migrating sandspit proved so complex that the park was not formally established until 1953 and dedicated in 1958. The multi-decade delay highlighted the difficulty of establishing fixed legal boundaries across a dynamic landscape where land parcels frequently eroded into the ocean or were buried under shifting dune fields before survey titles could be cleared. 16. The shallow sound engineered for modern wind sport. Behind the barrier islands sits Pamlico Sound, an estuarine body of water covering nearly 80 kilometers in length and 48 kilometers in width, with an average depth of just 1.4 meters. Oceanographic bathymetry surveys show that this combination of vast surface area, consistent coastal wind regimes, and waist-deep water creates a specialized environment for non-motorized watercraft. The shallow, flat water conditions allow riders to navigate kilometers offshore while remaining able to stand on the sandy floor, turning an area historically feared by deep-draft sailing vessels into a globally recognized center for kiteboarding and windsurfing. 15. Two naval disasters that reformed coastal lifesaving. Within a 2-month period in late 1877 and early 1878, 2 major maritime disasters occurred off the same stretch of beach. On November 24, 1877, the iron-hulled Navy gunboat USS Huron ran aground 180 meters off Nag's Head during a gale, resulting in 98 fatalities because the nearby life-saving station was uncrewed out of season. On 31st of January 1878, the steamship Metropolis struck the shoals off Currituck, killing 85 passengers. Public outcry over the combined loss of nearly 200 lives forced Congress to restructure the life-saving service, providing year-round funding, building new stations, and expanding professional surfman crews along the entire eastern seaboard. 14. The old-growth forest hidden behind oceanic dunes. Directly behind the oceanfront dunes at Nag's Head sits Nag's Head Woods, a 485-hectare preserve containing old-growth hardwood forest. Dendrochronological sampling and soil core analysis confirm the forest canopy, comprising sweet gum, beech, oak, and pine, is between 700 and 1,000 years old, with individual trees exceeding 300 years of age. The forest exists because massive maritime dunes on the eastern perimeter act as a physical barrier against ocean wind and salt spray, creating a microclimate that allows an inland Appalachian-style plant community to persist on a narrow barrier island. 13. The mid-century settlement dismantled and forgotten. Following the Union capture of Roanoke Island in February 1862, the site became a sanctuary for thousands of people escaping slavery, leading to the establishment of the Roanoke Island Freedmen's Colony in 1863. By 1865, the community had grown to nearly 4,000 residents, complete with mapped street grids, churches, schools, and local timber mills. Following the conclusion of the Civil War, federal directives restored land titles to pre-war landholders, resulting in the complete dismantling of the settlement's infrastructure by 1867. Modern archaeological investigations using ground-penetrating radar and historical cadastral maps have worked to map the precise footprint of this short-lived urban development. 12. The deep-water trench bringing game fish near the shore. The continental shelf off the Outer Banks narrows significantly compared to the rest of the Atlantic seaboard, bringing deep oceanic waters and the Gulf Stream within 30 kilometers of the coastline. Marine bathymetry charts produced by oceanographic agencies show that deep-water trenches and thermal fronts concentrate high densities of pelagic species like blue marlin, yellowfin tuna, and red drum. This oceanographic configuration supports major commercial and sport fisheries, including multi-million-dollar tournaments and the all-tackle world record red drum, a 42.6 kilogram specimen landed near Avon in 1984. 11. A foreign military grave plot on an isolated island. On Ocracoke Island, a small enclosed cemetery flies the British Union Jack over 4 grave sites. In May 1942, during the height of the Battle of the Atlantic, the armed Royal Navy trawler HMS Bedfordshire was torpedoed off the coast by a German U-boat, killing all 37 crew members. When 4 bodies washed ashore, local residents buried them in a dedicated plot. The site was later granted in perpetuity to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, creating an official British military cemetery maintained by the United States Coast Guard and local caretakers on a remote sandbar. While these historical and geological markers document centuries of adaptation, what happens when modern instruments measure the rate at which the island itself is moving? 10. The inland estuarine basin covering 2,300 square kilometers. Behind the narrow protective sandbar lies Pamlico Sound, a body of water covering roughly 2,300 square kilometers with a maximum length of 130 kilometers and widths up to 48 kilometers. Bathymetric mapping conducted by oceanographers demonstrates that despite its vast surface area, the basin maintains an average depth of less than 2 meters. This expansive, shallow reservoir serves as an estuary nursery for commercially vital marine species across the Atlantic seaboard, while also supporting over 1 million migratory waterfowl during winter months. However, hydrodynamics models show that during severe tropical storms, northeasterly winds force immense volumes of water into the shallow basin, driving rapid storm surges against mainland coastal communities. 9. Wrecks exposed along the intertidal zone. The dynamic shore face does not retain all historical shipwrecks in deep offshore waters. Several prominent wooden and iron hulls lie directly within the intertidal sand zone. At Coquina Beach near Bodie Island, the timber frame of the 4-masted schooner Laura A. Barnes, grounded during a 1921 nor'easter, remains partially visible in the beach sand. Between Avon and Salvo, the iron framing of the G.A. Kohler, driven ashore by a hurricane in 1933, routinely emerges and vanishes under shifting dune sand, depending on seasonal wave energy. Park Service survey logs document how individual winter storms can unearth multi-ton structural timbers buried for decades, only for subsequent tide cycles to recover them completely. 8. The historical origin behind local place names. Local oral tradition maintains that the community of Nag's Head derived its name from wreckers who tied lanterns to the necks of horses, walking them along sand dunes at night to decoy ships onto shallow sandbars. Historical researchers and archivists from regional institutions have examined land grant records and found no contemporary evidence supporting this claim. Survey records indicate the name likely stems from cartographic references to prominent headlands in England or early 18th century topographical charts depicting dune profiles resembling a horse's head. The persistence of the wrecker legend illustrates how deeply the history of maritime disasters shaped regional identity and folklore. 7. The coastal land grant bearing an ambiguous origin. Further north along the barrier chain sits Bodie Island, home to a prominent 48-meter brick lighthouse. Early colonial land records from 1722 confirm that a tract of 770 hectares was granted to a settler named Matthew Midget, with land registry documents recording ownership under a family named Bodie or Body. Parallel local historical accounts contend that the stretch of coast earned its phonetic title from the large number of human remains washing ashore from offshore wrecks during the 18th and 19th centuries. The current light tower, completed in 1872, represents the third attempt to mark the hazard, after the first structure suffered foundation collapse into unstable sand in 1859, and the second was destroyed during military operations in 1861. 6. The single provincial transit line facing continuous destruction. North Carolina Highway 12 serves as the sole paved transportation corridor linking the communities across the barrier chain, running along a narrow strip of sand bounded by the Atlantic Ocean and Pamlico Sound. Transportation Department expenditure records indicate that maintaining this single asphalt line requires tens of millions of Canadian dollars in continuous clearing, reconstruction, and sand removal. In 2003, Hurricane Isabel severed the highway by cutting a 500-meter-wide inlet through Hatteras Island, while Hurricane Irene in 2011 caused damages requiring over $70 million in infrastructure repairs. Coastal geologists from Duke University and Natural Resources Canada note that because the barrier island is actively migrating landward, holding the road in a fixed position requires ongoing engineering intervention against natural geomorphic processes. 5. The permanent island community accessible only by water. At the southern terminus of the barrier chain lies Ocracoke Island, a 26-kilometer sandbar home to a year-round population of roughly 900 residents. The settlement possesses no bridge connection to the mainland or neighboring islands, relying entirely on air transport, private vessels, or state-operated ferry services. The primary ferry route from Hatteras requires 70 minutes of navigation across open water, while mainland ferry crossings from Cedar Island take over 2 hours. When storm conditions force the suspension of ferry operations, the entire community is isolated from external supply chains, requiring emergency management planning to account for absolute physical isolation. 4. The wartime naval battlefield active off coastal beaches. During the first 6 months of 1942, following the entry of North America into the Second World War, the German Navy deployed U-boats along the Atlantic coast under Operation Drumbeat. The waters off Cape Hatteras became known among Naval Command as Torpedo Junction, due to the intense concentration of merchant shipping losses. Documented naval logs confirm that 82 Allied merchant vessels were torpedoed off the North Carolina coast during this brief campaign. Coastal blackouts were not strictly enforced during the early months, allowing submarine crews to silhouette target vessels against illuminated beach towns. Residents along the shore routinely witnessed offshore explosions and retrieved oil debris and washed-up cargo from the beach strand. 3. The completely preserved mid-century ghost town. At the southern end of the chain on Portsmouth Island stands Portsmouth Village, established in 1753 as a primary lightering port where ocean-going vessels offloaded cargo onto shallow draft boats to cross the Sound. Historical census figures show the population peaked at nearly 700 residents in 1860. However, after major hurricanes in 1846 opened deeper inlets elsewhere along the coast, maritime commercial traffic bypassed the port, leading to a multi-generation population decline. The village school closed in 1942, and by 1971, the last 2 permanent residents departed. The site remains preserved by the National Park Service as an intact, uninhabited 18th-century maritime settlement, accessible only by boat. 2. The 4-century-old disappearance on Roanoke Island. In August 1587, a group of 118 English colonists established a settlement on Roanoke Island. When Governor John White returned to the site in 1590 after being delayed in Europe by naval conflicts, the entire population had vanished, without evidence of physical struggle or destruction. The only tangible clue was the word Croatoan, carved into a wooden palisade post, referencing the indigenous community inhabiting nearby Hatteras Island. Modern archaeological investigations utilizing sediment core analysis, ground-penetrating radar, and historical climate reconstructions indicate that a severe regional drought occurred between 1587 and 1589, supporting theories that survivors assimilated into local First Nations communities to secure food and water. As these physical and historical records show, human structures and settlements have repeatedly succumbed to the forces shaping this coastline. But what is the fundamental geological mechanism driving the entire chain of sandbars to move? 1. The landform itself is continuously moving. Every phenomenon across this coastline, the masonry lighthouse jacked onto steel rails, the highway washed into the surf, the inlets carved in a single storm, the towns dismantled and floated across sound waters, and the settlements that vanished without a trace, stems from a single physical mechanism. These barrier islands are not fixed geological landforms. They are dynamic deposits of unconsolidated sand sitting in an open ocean environment, operating as what coastal geologists describe as a continuous river of sand. Driven by rising sea levels, storm wave action, and overwash processes, sediment is stripped from the ocean beach face during severe weather events, carried across the narrow island interior, and deposited along the western sound margin. As a result, the entire island chain is migrating landward toward the mainland at an average rate of 1 to 2 meters every year. What kept this fundamental reality hidden for so long was not a lack of observations, but a baseline cartographic assumption. Early cartographers, land surveyors, and civil engineers mapped these barrier islands using static survey grids, treating dynamic sand deposits as fixed geographical boundaries simply because they appeared as continuous landlines on paper. Geomorphologists, coastal engineers, and hydrographers from institutions like the Geological Survey of Canada, Natural Resources Canada, and regional universities continue to monitor this coastline using airborne laser scanning, bathymetric sonar, and satellite altimetry. Yet crucial questions remain unanswered. Researchers are still calculating the exact volume of sand lost to deep-water offshore trenches during major nor'easters, and it remains uncertain how long coastal infrastructure can be maintained before rising ocean levels force a complete managed retreat from migrating sandbars. The official map sheet presents a clear, permanent boundary between land and water, but the physical ground beneath it remains in constant motion. Which geographic anomaly or forgotten site in your own province or territory has always raised questions for you, or which item on this list was most unexpected?